Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are continuing our RFK series. In episode one, we talked about the evidence and, of course, the facts of the case. If you weren't familiar with the scenario, went down in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in 1968, and then we got into the evidence, the ballistics evidence, the coroner's report, autopsy, and then the eyewitness statements, all of which pointed to the fact that there had to be a second shooter. We didn't get into the second shooter yet, but we will today, um, because Sirhan's gun only held 8 shots, and all 8 of his shots were accounted for. The first 2 were in RFK's direction, both missed. One hit Paul Schrade. They were able to retrieve that bullet from Paul Schrade's head. Another buried itself in the door jamb. Then he was tackled, and the other 6 shots went in the opposite direction and injured 5 people, one of them twice. So they pulled 6 bullets out of 5 people. They pulled a bullet out of a door jamb. They pulled a bullet out of Paul Schrade. That's all 8 shots. And yet RFK had 3 wounds from behind. He was shot 4 times from behind. One went through his jacket, the padding on his jacket collar or his shoulder. But 3 of them uh, wounded him, one of them fatally. So the autopsy report showed that he was shot. There were at least 12 shots, 8 from Sirhan's gun and 4 that impacted RFK. Well, since there's only 8 shots that Sirhan had available to him in his chamber, there has to be a second shooter. And since none of the bullets from Sirhan's gun hit RFK, uh, you've got a problem because RFK is the one who's still sitting in a prison cell to this day in California. He's been denied parole, I don't know how many times, 17, 18 times, because he never expressed remorse for what he did or apologized. To this day, he doesn't remember it. How can he express remorse for something he doesn't remember? And of course, according to the evidence, his bullets, though he was trying to kill RFK, there's no question he fired the first 2 shots in RFK's direction, but none of his bullets made contact with RFK. So, and yet we get to trial and he confesses, and his attorney buries him. So, if you are familiar with these cases, and when I say these cases, I'm talking JFK, RFK, MLK, you start to smell a rat right away. So, today we're going to be looking at episode 2 and introduce you to somebody else who was present that day, who may have been, probably was the second shooter. I titled this series The Manchurian Murder because Manchurian is sort of the patsy, somebody who's been set up to take the fall, to make it look like he did it, when somebody else from a different vantage point is actually firing the kill shots. These are my sources. I talked about them the other day, but I like to review them just so you know who I'm uh, referencing. A lot of it comes from RFK Jr., the son of RFK, who has very strong feelings about who he thinks killed his daddy. Lisa Peace wrote a really good book, A Lie Too Big to Fail. William Pepper was the family attorney for Sirhan after he was convicted and has a lot of inside knowledge. He's dead now, but if you listen to him on YouTube or read his book, you start to see some real similar patterns because he was also the family attorney for Martin Luther King after he was assassinated. You start to see some of the same patterns. That's what he picked up on. Great source, William Pepper. Talbot wrote a good book, The Brothers, a lot of good background information in there, and then these 2 books as well. Collateral Damage. Uh, Most of these sources on RFK paint him a certain way. Collateral Damage kind of takes the opposite view, which is RFK was dirtier than most people think and was responsible. In that picture, you see Dorothy Kilgallen, you see Marilyn Monroe, you see JFK. The authors point or his thesis and collateral damage is that RFK was largely responsible for those 3 assassinations or deaths or murders, and then got caught up and eventually was killed by the same group of people that he had used or had been linked to him in those other 3 deaths. So less than flattering profile. Okay, started to talk about bullet count, and this is where you first notice that there can't be that Sirhan couldn't have been the only shooter, because in addition to the 3 shots that hit Kennedy from behind, according to the medical examiner, Noguchi, and then a 4th bullet that passed through his shoulder pad, there were 5 other people that were hit, 1 twice. So that totals 9 shots, really 10 if you add the 4 to the 6. That's 10. Sirhan's 22 only held 8 bullets. So right there, you have 2 shots that didn't come from Sirhan. Then FBI agent William Bailey found 2 bullets lodged in the pantry door frame, which increases it to 11 or 12, depending on what your count is at the. And then police and FBI photographs show 2 more bullet holes in the pantry door divider and another hole in the jamb of a backstage door, suggesting at least 4 more shots. You're up to 15 or 16 shots now. And witnesses who were there on the scene swear to a minimum of at least 12 shots. So you have a range here of possible shots between 12 and 16, according to the evidence and according to the eyewitnesses. And Sirhan's gun could only be responsible for half of those. So clearly we have a problem. Interesting thing about these cases is that as years go by, new evidence comes up or new technology comes up, which is able to take old evidence and shed new light on it. In 2005, the audio engineer, a man named Philip Van Praag, examined the sound recording of the shooting in the pantry that day, and he concluded 13 sounds, which sound like shot. It reminds me of the House Select Committee when they got the recording from the motorcycle cop. And for the first time, we're able to hear all the sounds going on in Dealey Plaza that day. And he came back, they had a sound engineer who looked into that, came back with way more than 3 shots. Yeah, he was up around, I think he said a minimum of 7 or 8, could go as high as 13. And so House Select Committee had to change their conclusion at the last minute. They were going to double down on the Warren report. And now all of a sudden, because of new evidence, they had to say, well, there was more than 3 shots for sure. One of them even came from the grassy knoll, according to the sound evidence, so had to be a conspiracy. Well, here again, we have an audio engineer who hears way more than 8 shots, and he comes up with 13, and 2 of them are double shots, which indicates there has to be a second shooter, because it's possible for 2 shots to happen on top of each other like that if it's just one shooter coming from the same gun. He also determined that 5 of these shots were fired from the opposite direction of Sirhan. So Sirhan was always facing, according to the eyewitnesses and the ballistics, everybody said Sirhan was always facing RFK. So this means that these 5 shots, according to the sound engineer, came from behind Kennedy. And we know that 4 of those shots made contact with Kennedy from behind. 3 of them caused wounds. 1 of them was fatal. So clearly, when you get into the bullet count, any reasonable person cannot conclude that Sirhan did all the shooting. Somebody else was there shooting. And according to the evidence, they were behind Kennedy. And there was only one person behind. I'm going to introduce you to him in just a second. Everybody else was even with Kennedy or in front of Kennedy. There was one man behind him pushing him into this ambush. And 5 shots came from behind, 4 of which made contact with Kennedy, 3 of which wounded him. 1 killed him. And they were also close. They left carbon tattoos on either his clothing or his flesh. And they were all in an upward trajectory, meaning someone was concealing a gun down low, shooting upward like an execution style shot. And it wasn't from the front. It wasn't a 22 slug It wasn't from Sirhan's 22 anyway. By the way, this is a representation, a visual of that sound recording that the sound engineer was looking. You can see the first two shots coming from Sirhan's gun happened at 0.000, the next one 0.457, and then there's a gap. And then boom, boom, 3 and 4 happen right on top of each other. 5, 6, then 7 and 8, boom, boom, happen right on top of each other. Those are the double shots. Then 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Now, I'm not an expert in these type of graphs, but this guy is, and he was able to deduce that these are 13 gunshot sounds. And that's how he concluded 13 shots. So that fits right in with what the coroner said. You know, we have the first two shots we know came from Sirhan, and where they ended up, because one ended up in Paul Schrade's head, and they retrieved it. Another ended up in the door jamb, and LAPD retrieved it. Then shots 3 through 8, the 6 shots, after the 6 security people jumped on top of him, were fired in the opposite direction. And we know where they ended up because they ended up in 5 people's bodies. One of them got hit twice. So that's all 8 shots from Sirhan. None of them hit Kennedy. All right. And then we know because of the autopsy report that 4 shots did make contact with Kennedy. 2 of them hit him in the armpit. 1 of them hit him in the back of the head behind the ear. And 1 of them went through his jacket, through his shoulder pad. That's 4. So that's at least 12 shots, which is exactly what the eyewitnesses say. And then you have the sound engineer who comes up with a 13th, and some of the other evidence, photos and such, go as high as 16. So way more. The point is way more than one shooter, and the number of bullets that Sirhan had in his gun. So this is the guy that was behind Kennedy. His name is Thane Eugene Cesar. He had been hired 2 days prior by Ace Guard Service to help protect RFK. Now, you remember we told the story in episode 1, RFK was not yet the Democrat nominee, so he did not have Secret Service protection. So he's having to provide his own protection. And he's got friends and supporters, former football players, former Olympic athletes, Rayford Johnson, Rosie Greer, big guys, right? And Ace Guard Service was employed by the Ambassador Hotel to provide extra security for RFK that night. Cesar was only on his second assignment the night RFK was killed. And you start looking into his background, you start noticing some things. If you're paying any attention at all, and you've studied, for example, the JFK assassination, any detail at all, they start to raise your eyebrows. And it doesn't take but a second. I don't believe in coincidences. There's some unbelievable, if you want to call them coincidences here, but I just don't happen to believe in coincidences anymore. Look at his background. He was working. He had a full-time job. So he's not just a rent-a-cop. It appears he's a rent-a-cop. It appears he just got, hired on for some extra income. This is not your typical mall cop we're talking about here, looking for extra income. He worked at Lockheed Aircraft Defense Plant in Burbank, a suburb of LA, which is home of the U-2 spy plane. That's the most secret program our government had going at the time. This spy plane, you had to have high-level security clearances to work anywhere near the U-2 spy plane, which of course he did. Sound familiar? Lee Harvey Oswald worked in a U-2 spy plane in Japan, and also had high-level security clearances. So here we have Thane Eugene Cesar working for the DOD at a U-2 spy plane plant in Burbank, and just 2 days prior gets hired on by Ace Guard Services to provide extra security for RFK, probably the next president of the United States. Yep. Before Lockheed, and this is where you really start to see a trend or a pattern here with Cesar, and it really starts to lead back to his real connections. He worked for Hughes Aircraft Engineering. This is a Howard Hughes defense company. And of course, Howard Hughes' right-hand man during during this time period was Robert Maheu. Robert Maheu's private security firm provided all security for Hughes Aircraft and Engineering, all of the Hughes defense-related plants or factories. Robert Maheu's security firm was in charge of providing security for. And this guy, Thane Eugene Cesar, worked for Robert Maheu's private security firm in this highly secure environment. You say, well, what's Howard Hughes? What's he got to do with it? Well, you remember Howard Hughes was the guy that Nixon was connected to back in '60. He went to Howard Hughes and said, I want you to create a secret assassination team, take out Castro so I can win the election. And if you remember the story, Hughes went to his associate, Robert Maheu, his attorney, who handled all these things. He says, put this together for the future president of the United States. And Maheu, if you remember, contacted Johnny Rosselli. Johnny Rosselli contacted Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana contacted Santos Trafficante. They all went down and met in Miami at the Fontainebleau Hotel. And Santos says, well, I'm not going to do this if I don't have assurances that this is coming from Kennedy or from Nixon, the future president. So they had another meeting. This time Nixon sent down his chief of security from the CIA, a man named Sheffield Edwards. And then they were able to hammer it out because now Santos is convinced that this is coming from the top. It's coming from Nixon. Well, Maheu is the guy who put all that together. This was an S-force designed to take out Castro. Now we're going to, and this guy worked for him, Thane Eugene Cesar. So, by the way, this top right is a picture of Maheu and Howard Hughes in happier times. They're eventually going to split. It's going to be a nasty split. But this is during the days. Howard Hughes was the money man. And he hired people like Maheu to handle all the dirty business. Maheu was his guy. By the way, Howard Hughes had another guy who handled things for him in Washington. His name was Larry O'Brien. Larry O'Brien's going to come into play here in a minute as well. We'll get to him in a second. But Howard Hughes doesn't do any of this himself. He has people who do these things for him. And Maheu was his connection to the plot to kill Castro, which later turned into a plot to kill Kennedy. This is the bottom right is the picture at the Fontainebleau Hotel. Maheu's pictured at the right. Johnny Rosselli is in the middle with his hands crossed. And there's Sheffield Edwards. And he's there on behalf of Nixon and the CIA to convince Santos Trafficante to go ahead and put this assassination team together. Famous meeting. According to David Talbot and Lisa Peace, in their books, they both identified Robert Maheu as Howard Hughes' right-hand man, which is undisputed. It's well documented. He's also a former FBI agent, which gives him real access points into all things Washington. And he happens to be one of the CIA's Castro assassination plot coordinators. As we just learned in this S-Force, he's the guy that brought all these people together at this meeting in Fontainebleau. By the way, there were two of these meetings. We've already talked about the two with respect to the S-Force. There was a third, actually, came a year or so later, where it's the same people. It's Maheu, it's Rosselli, it's Santos Trafficante, it's Sam Giancana, and they're being met by William Harvey's man with poison pills and $10,000 cash to another attempt to assassinate Castro. And Maheu's present at that meeting as well. And again, he's there representing Howard Hughes and bringing together the mob and the CIA in this conspiracy to kill Castro. So, according to Talbot and Lisa Peace, the fact that Robert Maheu is linked to this RFK assassination proves to them that he's the likely planner of the Robert Kennedy assassination. You say, well, that's a big leap to make. Well, multiple government documents proved that Maheu worked in the plot to kill Castro. And we know, we've talked about the Fontainebleau meetings, we've talked about the poison pills, the S-Force. We know that S-Force in particular turned and eventually is the group of people that killed Kennedy. So Maheu being involved in the creation of the S-Force puts Maheu and his boss, Hughes, and we're going to talk about Hughes's connection to Nixon, all in the same orbit of the people who killed Kennedy. So they're involved. Um, and the fact that we're now learning that Thane Eugene Cesar, the man who pushed RFK into that pantry area in the kitchen, worked for Maheu, puts on Maheu at the center of another assassination. So he is, whether directly or indirectly, he is related to or associated with people directly involved in the assassination of both Kennedy brothers. And of course, as far as motive is concerned, Talbot interviewed him and got him to admit on the record that he hated both the Kennedys. So he's got motive, he's got the means, you know. You think about the means, he's got the S Force in the JFK case, he's got the Thane Eugene Cesar in the RFK case, and he's got the opportunity because the S Force was trained specifically in the skill of shooting with high-powered rifles using scopes at a moving target from distance. That was how they're going to take out Castro. Well, go to Dallas. How did they take out Kennedy? It was high-powered rifles with scopes, a moving target from distance. And then you look at RFK, again, opportunity. You don't get much more opportunity than your man being the guy behind RFK, close enough that he could shoot him 4 times, leaving carbon tattoos on his flesh or on his clothing, these contact shots, and he's your guy. So Talbot and Lisa Pease both identified Robert Maheu as the likely planner of the Robert Kennedy assassination. And it's because you again, I don't believe in coincidences. You start to piece together the connections that he had to the S Force and the JFK assassination, and voila, he appears again now in the RFK assassination, and you start to smell a rat. John Meyer worked for Howard Hughes, and he says that not only did Thane Eugene Cesar work for Maheu's private security firm doing work for Howard Hughes, he also worked, that private security firm that Maheu owned also performed top secret activities for the CIA. Uh-oh. So now you're bringing the CIA. We've already learned that the CIA was at the Fontainebleau meeting. So they're connected to the S Force and JFK assassination. Now we're learning that the guy who I believe assassinated RFK is connected to Maheu's, and they're both doing work for the CIA, according to John Meyer. And if you want to take it higher than that, Hughes, everybody here that we're talking about, indirectly or directly works for Hughes. Maheu works for Hughes. Thane Eugene Cesar works for Maheu, and Maheu works for Hughes. So they're all under the Hughes umbrella. And Hughes is connected to Nixon. Long-time financial contributor to the Nixon campaigns, also to the Nixon family, and also to B.B. Rebozo. B.B. Rebozo was Nixon's guy down in Miami who handled all of Nixon's slush funds. All that cash had to come from somewhere. Just like we talked about the S-Force cash coming from the 2 casinos in Las Vegas and being laundered by Meyer Lansky through the Miami Bank down in Switzerland back to Mexico. This money that Nixon used as a slush fund came straight from Howard Hughes through the hands of Robert Maheu to B.B. Rebozo, and that's how he paid all of his covert operators, including the Watergate burglars, for their missions, for their silence, for whatever. It's all coming from Howard Hughes. This is an interesting thing. It happens in 72 when Watergate makes it on the front pages, is the connection back to Howard Hughes that could have blown up in Nixon's face. He was really worried about it as early as 71, 72, before the election, because, as I mentioned earlier, Larry O'Brien was now the DNC chair, and Larry O'Brien had been for years the chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. for Howard Hughes, and as such knew about all the dealings for years and years and years between Howard Hughes and Richard Nixon. And Nixon was terrified that Larry O'Brien would use this information against him, specifically what he knew about the S-Force, the creation of the S-Force, in the 72 campaign. And of course, it just so happens that about that same time, Robert Maheu has had a falling out with Howard Hughes and is now leaking to prominent reporters like Drew Pearson, for example, about the money trail that he had been facilitating from Howard Hughes to Nixon through B.B. Rebozo all these years. And so, of course, Maheu was also aware of the creation of the S-Force because he was there when it was created. So these connections that Nixon has are extremely, you talk about risky or reckless. And if it comes out in the 72 campaign, any of this, all the financial wheeling and dealing and this illegal slush fund that Nixon had down in Miami through B.B. Rebozo, was coming from Howard Hughes, being facilitated by Robert Maheu, or worse, the creation of the S Force, which later killed Kennedy in 63. Any of this gets out, Kennedy's in duck soup and he knows it. It's one of the reasons he sent the burglars into the Watergates, trying to find out what Larry O'Brien knew. So anyway, this connection that Thane Eugene Cesar has to Robert Maheu is, to someone who has studied the JFK assassination and Mayhew's connection to the S Force, it sends off alarm bells when you see that he's also connected, or someone that he knows or worked for him, a trusted associate, is now connected to the RFK assassination. It puts Maheu in the center of both, is what I'm saying. And if Mayhew's in the center of both, that means Howard Hughes is in the center of both. If Howard Hughes is in the center of both, that means Nixon's in the center of both. Now, I'm not saying Nixon ordered the assassinations of either one, but people in his orbit were responsible, which means he, by extension, is responsible. According to Lisa Peace, and documents that she researched for her book, Cesar actually self-identified as a CIA agent. This is a picture of Thane Eugene Cesar at the time of his death. This was put, how they show photos of people around their casket and stuff. This is one of those photos. So this is this is a later picture of Thane Eugene Cesar. And she says that he self-identified as a CIA agent. He was just some more background information. He was an avowed racist. He supported George Wallace for president, and he hated RFK because he thought RFK was going to start a race war and put blacks in charge of the country. So here we see clear motive that Thane Eugene Cesar would have to want to assassinate, if he had the opportunity, someone like RFK. He hated the Kennedys. He worked for a guy, Robert Maheu, who told Talbot he hated the Kennedys. He was a supporter of Wallace because he was a racist. And of course, Robert Kennedy was, like his brother, was starting to take civil rights movement as part of his central, one of his main issues. And so he had many reasons or many motives to want to participate in an assassination of RFK. And of course, his employer, Robert Maheu, had put together an assassination team to kill Castro, which later turned to kill Kennedy. So he had expertise in these sorts of things. Anyway, you start to see these connections, and then you look at where he was at the time of the shooting. Thane Eugene Cesar was next to RFK, kind of steering him from behind by the elbow into the kitchen. RFK was not originally supposed to go through the back kitchen. I'm going to show you a layout here in a minute, and you'll see where he was supposed to go. He was supposed to exit the Ambassador Hotel a different way, but at the last minute, they change and they exit him through the back kitchen, and he gets steered by Thane Eugene Cesar by the elbow in the direction of Sirhan, who's waiting for him in an ambush. When the shooting actually began, Cesar was standing behind and slightly to the right of Kennedy, in the exact firing position as described by the autopsy. Now, in that top picture, top right, I told you Thane Eugene Cesar is careful to stay in the background, in the shadows. Usually you can identify him by the hat he's wearing. There you can see the hat as RFK is shaking hands, just about ready to turn and make his way into the pantry, into the kitchen. Thane Eugene Cesar is lurking in the background. You can't see his face. You can see his hat. That's him. He was the only one there that day working in that capacity, wearing that hat in that proximity to RFK. And so we know that that's him. So, boy, he's in the perfect location. During the shooting, Bobby falls backwards and he lands on Cesar. And I've shown this photo before, but I left out purposely the clip-on tie, which is laying on the floor, indicating that RFK must have realized the direction from which he was being shot, which was from behind. RFK's last act was to turn and pull off Cesar's clip-on tie. And we know that that is Cesar's clip-on tie because right beforehand, he was pictured wearing the tie, and right afterwards, he was pictured not wearing the tie. The tie was on the ground. RFK, there are actual pictures of him holding Cesar's clip-on tie in his hand. Now, this, as you can see, he is grasping something, and it's a rosary. RFK's wife, who was present on the scene, removed the tie and replaced it with a rosary as he lay there dying on the kitchen floor. And as I mentioned, there are pictures of Cesar later in the evening without his tie. So we've talked about the connections that Cesar had to, first of all, he's working for Department of Defense. He's got high security clearances to be able to work in this U2 factory. Before that, he worked for Robert Maheu's private security firm, which handled all the security for Howard Hughes. We already know that Maheu was involved in the assassination plot with the CIA and the mob to kill Castro. And of course, the Cubans were involved in that as well. He was front and center in that at the request of his boss, who was phoned from the White House by Richard Nixon, who everybody thinks is going to be the next president, to put this together. So it goes all the way to the top. And that is the S-Force is the team that eventually killed Kennedy in 1963. This is the same guy who is the boss of Thane Eugene Cesar. And according to John Meyer, not only did they provide security for Howard Hughes, they also did secret jobs for the CIA. So this connects Maheu again to the CIA beyond the connection back in 1960 with the creation of the S-Force. This connects them in 1968 to the CIA, still doing work for the CIA. And of course, if Maheu's doing work for the CIA, that means his employee, his protege, so to speak, his security specialist, Thane Eugene Cesar, is also doing work for the CIA. And Lisa Peace says that he admitted to her, or she saw in documents, he self-admitted that he was a, quote, CIA agent. And of course, he and his boss, Thane Eugene Cesar and Robert Maheu, have both admitted that they hated the Kennedys. Thane Eugene Cesar, because he was a racist and thought he was going to start a race war by putting the blacks in charge, and on and on. There's just too much smoke here. I realize a lot of it's circumstantial. You don't have a confession. You don't have an eyewitness. But in most cases, it involves the CIA. You're not going to have any of that anyway. You're certainly not going to have a document, a smoking gun document. So you have to take these circumstances and puzzle pieces and put them together. And of course, the evidence does show that Kennedy was shot from behind. And the only guy who was pushing him through that pantry, standing behind him, leading him by the elbow, close enough to create contact shot wounds to Kennedy, was Thane Eugene Cesar. And according to eyewitnesses, they saw Cesar with his gun drawn during this altercation. One eyewitness said he saw him fire. So now we have evidence that Thane Eugene Cesar, not only was he behind Kennedy, not only was he in the place where the autopsy said the fatal shots were fired from, but eyewitnesses said that he pulled his gun and that he fired with his gun. When the LAPD asked him why he drew his weapon, Cesar claimed, and this is perfectly reasonable, that he was shooting back at the assailant, Sirhan. But there was never any evidence found that Cesar's gun fired in Sirhan's direction. There would have been bullets, right? But there weren't any. They didn't find any evidence from Cesar's gun. And the reason we know they didn't find any evidence from Cesar's gun is because they never took his gun. At a crime scene, especially any crime scene, but one of this high profile, anybody pulls a gun, fires it, it's going to be confiscated, and ballistics is going to take a look at it because they got to trace where those bullets ended up, who shot, how many bullets were fired, who shot who. I mean, that's just standard operating procedure. The LAPD never checked and or confiscated Cesar's gun, even though Cesar admitted that he fired it at the crime scene. They never took it. Later, when they came back to ask him about it, He was caught in all kinds of lies because he said he was only carrying a 38 caliber revolver that night. And none of the bullets found were 38s, so he thought that would clear him. But what he didn't tell the LAPD is that he had a 22 caliber revolver also at the time. He just withheld that information. And then when they finally found out about it, he said, "Well, I sold it 4 months prior to the assassination, so I didn't think it was relevant." But the sales receipt proved that he sold it 3 months afterwards, so he lied. In other words, he hid from the investigators the fact that he owned a 22. He admitted to having a 38. He admitted to pulling it out, waving it around. He admitted to firing it. They never found a 38 slug. He didn't admit he had a 22 when he got caught in that lie of omission. He said, "Well, no, I sold it 4 months before, so I didn't think it was worth mentioning." They found out, no, he didn't sell it till 3 months after. So he's purposely being evasive. And when they went to the buyer and asked him about the purchase and confirmed it had been bought 3 months after the assassination, they asked him if there was anything unusual about it. He says, "Well, he told me that it had been involved in a, quote, police shooting." Now, there's no other record of Thane Eugene Cesar being involved in any altercation that involved shooting with respect to that 22, other than the only time he was involved in any sort of a shooting was when RFK was shot. So the thinking is that he had two guns on him that night. He had the 38, which was cover. That was his standard issue. But the 22 is the one he used. And then because it was never confiscated or nobody even ever asked for it, he just took it home afterwards and disposed of it. 3 months later, he sold it and hid it from the police. The LAPD never admitted to having it, then lied about it when they found out he did have it, but then told the buyer that he had been involved in a police shooting. So the fact that LAPD did not check and or confiscate his gun, even though Cesar admitted to firing it at the crime scene. I mean, they didn't even take his 38, much less the 22. Seems pretty self-evident that Cesar had two guns on him that night. He had the 38, which he never used, but he had the 22, which he hid from police, and then sold it soon afterwards and told the buyer it had been involved in a police shooting. All the bullet slugs that they found were 22s, which was convenient because that's what Sirhan was using. The problem is Sirhan only had 8 shells, and we're finding many, many more shells than that at the scene. Somebody else had a 22. And according to witnesses, they saw two people with guns. They saw Sirhan with his, and then they saw Thane Eugene Cesar with his. And so it just stands to reason he was the second shooter, right? Seems clear to me. A second unbelievable fact about what happened at night was that, and subsequent, was that the LAPD destroyed their 2,200 photos of the crime scene, including the door frames and ceiling panels, all had bullet holes. It's the same old scenario. In Dallas, evidence was destroyed because it was becoming increasingly clear to investigators that there were more bullets than just 3. And if you're going to stick to the lone gunman theory, especially in a situation where the lone gunman was using a bolt action rifle, you only had time to fire 3 shots. And so all the other shots had to, go away. They had to disappear. Well, you have the same situation here. Thane Eugene Cesar's gun only holds 8 shots. And if you have pictures of ceiling panels or pictures of door frames or door jambs of more bullet holes, that means more bullets. And that means a second shooter. And all the efforts are going to be to pin everything on one man, Sirhan. Again, I asked the question, sound familiar? They suppressed their files in this case for 20 years. For 20 years, researchers, investigators, even people, attorneys like William Pepper trying to get evidence to free Sirhan on parole, couldn't get access to this evidence. And we find out later it's because most of it's exculpatory. Most of it clears Sirhan, at least, of the murder, of RFK. It doesn't clear him of the attempted murder, but it clears him of the murder. And it points in a different direction as to who was the second shooter. And I think it's pretty clear that if you just look at the evidence, for example, the autopsy report by itself clears Sirhan of the murder of RFK. Because according to the autopsy report, all 8 shots from Sirhan's gun are accounted for. None of them hit RFK. The shots that hit RFK came from behind and an upward trajectory. And the only person we now know was behind RFK was Thane Eugene Cesar, as he led him, pushed him literally by the right elbow into the pantry, into the ambush. We have eyewitness statements that say Thane Eugene Cesar was seen pulling his gun. He admitted he was firing in the direction of Sirhan, even though those bullets were never found. He admitted he fired it. He admitted he had it. He admitted he fired it. And the only other gun that was found or seen by eyewitnesses was the one by Sirhan. And of course, both the audio engineer and the autopsy, the ballistics, they all show the fatal shots came from behind. And that's where Thane Eugene Cesar was. And we now know that he had a 22 that he sold later. He lied about it during the time of the investigation. He sold it later, even telling the buyer that he had been involved in a police shooting. So, and that's without even looking at his connections. You look at his connections to Maheu and Maheu's connections to the S-Force, Maheu's connections to Hughes, and all of their connections to Nixon, and their disdain for both Kennedys, their disdain for the civil rights movement, their disdain for Robert Kennedy and everything he stood for. And then you start looking at the means and opportunity and how the S-Force, was able to shoot from long distance with high-powered rifles with scopes at a moving target. That's how they trained. That's how they took out Kennedy. And then you look at the presence of Thane Eugene Cesar right behind RFK as he walks to the kitchen, close enough to shoot him at point-blank range. You see, my goodness, the connections, the motive, the means, the opportunity, it's all there. It's all there. But when you get to the trial, which will be episode 3, you'll see that none of that gets presented at court. None of that gets presented to the jury. It's a rushed court case. Sirhan tries to fire his attorney. Judge won't let him. Doesn't have any choice. He confesses. The confession gets him convicted. The autopsy report never gets presented. The ballistics report never gets presented. The eyewitness statements never get presented. The only thing the government presents is the eyewitness statements that when they walked into the pantry, there he was shooting at Kennedy, and he confesses and slam bam, thank you, ma'am. He's been in jail ever since. Meanwhile, the real perp, Thane Eugene Cesar, lived a long life, died here recently, and was never investigated. His gun was never taken. But you see his connections back, and it's always the same. This is what gets me. It's always the same. These guys always have connections to the agency. They always have connections to the CIA, whether it's through a third party or through someone. In Thane Eugene Cesar's case, he admitted to Lisa Pease to documents that Lisa Pease saw and put in her book that he was a CIA agent. And we know, according to witness John Meyer, that he worked for Robert Maheu, and they did secret work for the CIA. So that tells me this. Thane Eugene Cesar was connected to the CIA. Robert Maheu, who was his boss, was connected to the CIA. We know Robert Maheu was because of his meetings in '60 with the mob and the CIA to kill Castro. And we know because of Meyer, as late as '68, he was still doing work for the CIA. So that means Thane Eugene Cesar, who was a self-admitted CIA agent, his handler, so to speak, is Robert Maheu. And just like you look back at the JFK assassination, 2 months before JFK is assassinated, the CIA plants their guy in the Dallas Police Department. His name is Roscoe White. And I believe he's the guy who was behind the picket fence shooting from the grassy knoll on the day JFK was assassinated. He's wearing a police uniform, so he blends right in. He's infiltrated the security detail of JFK in Dealey Plaza that day. Well, just like that, here we have Thane Eugene Cesar, who is a CIA agent who 2 days prior to RFK's trip to LA infiltrates, no doubt acting on instructions, infiltrates the security detail of Robert F. Kennedy so that on the day that RFK is at the Ambassador Hotel, he would be in position to lead him through. No one would think twice. You saw him, he's pictured there in uniform. He's wearing his hat, just like Roscoe White was wearing his Dallas police uniform when he came out from behind the picket fence. All kinds of witnesses saw him. He blends. Here we have Thane Eugene Cesar wearing the policeman's uniform, so to speak, ace security. He is part of the security detail. He's the guy behind RFK, pushing him into the ambush and shooting him from behind, just like Roscoe White was the guy shooting him from behind the picket fence. And they always create a diversion, right? In Dallas, it was Lee Harvey Oswald up in, or whoever up in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Everybody's looking in that direction. Kill shot comes from behind a picket fence. Here, everybody's looking at Sirhan. Kill shot comes from behind. So next, in episode 3, we're going to talk about the trial itself and how he got railroaded. And then the 4th episode, we're going to look at the theory. And it is a theory. Again, we can't prove it, but there's a lot of anecdotal proof. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence to show that Thane Eugene Cesar was part of and Sirhan himself was part of a wider CIA program to create programmed assassins. And some of them have to be the patsies, and some of them have to be the actual gunmen. But we'll get into that later. So now what we've covered so far, just in a quick review, episode 1 was the facts of the case and the evidence. And hopefully that spurred you on to think, as we get into episode 2, that it had to be a second shooter. The evidence alone, we're not drawing any conclusions. We're just looking at the evidence, and the evidence said it couldn't be Sirhan. So then in episode 2, we look at who it could have been. And that's Thane Eugene Cesar, and most likely was. And then we look at Thane Eugene Cesar's connections, and the connections point back, unfortunately, again, to the CIA. All right, until next time, hope everybody has a blessed day. Thank you.